Thank you, Charles. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our potential exchange of views and ideas on what's happening in Iran. We all know that Iran had elections on the 18th of June, and what I will try to present in the next 30 minutes is first a few comments about the outcome of the Iranian elections, obviously also discussing what happened before the election, which has political significance. Then what does this outcome mean for Iran's future policies? We can always look at the domestic dynamics and also regional and international relations. What kind of relations will a Raisi government push once he takes over the government? What does this mean for the economy? I will look actually at two different scenarios which could both happen. And I will close with a few comments, with a few sort of strategic considerations for international business looking at Iran. So let's get started. Events leading up to the 18th of June were very important. Those of you following Iran realize that the Guardian Council made a very drastic decision to reject a number of mainstream candidates. I mean, no one would have imagined that the former parliament speaker, Ali Larijani, who was he has been the longest serving parliament speaker in post-revolutionary Iran, and even right now, he still has a position. He's an appointee by Mr. Khamenei himself, by the supreme leader himself. He's the special envoy on Iran-China relations. No one would have imagined that he would be rejected as a presidential candidate. Very few had imagined that the current sitting vice president, Ishaq Jahangiri, who, you know, who is from a so-called martyrs family, and he has been in high executive positions for the past 30 years, would be rejected. But they all were rejected. And what was more important was that Khamenei's request to actually review some of these rejections, potentially meaning that maybe Ali Larijani did not deserve to be rejected, was ignored by the Guardian Council. They said no, they have done it legally, and so we ended up with a very, very, very limited sort of range of potential candidates. Some of them then also withdrew themselves. We will look at that in a minute. But so the first question was always before the election, what's happening? Why is the Guardian Council doing this? And is it a reflection that Khamenei has lost power? This could be one scenario. Or is it a reflection of a new decision? Because for the Islamic Republic of Iran, voter participation was always significant. The highest leaders would always argue, including Khamenei himself, that voter turnout would legitimize the Iranian political structure, the revolutionary state. So I will spend a couple of minutes trying to understand the motivation for this. There were also other important facts, even though initially there was a lot of confusion because the reformists and also the moderate faction did not really have, candidates who could really win the election. There were two candidates, one Mr. Hemmati, the central bank governor, and Mr. Mehr Alizadeh, who was a very, very marginal figure in the reformist movement. So initially they were confused, but then towards the end of the campaign, they started supporting Hemmati. And what this translated into was a bit of an indication where the reformists are within the political balance of power. So let's spend a couple of minutes on trying to understand what the Guardian Council did and why. There are four theses in Iran right now. the first thesis is this was a power grab by the hardliners. They saw the opportunity, they saw the disillusionment and the apathy in the Iranian society, and they thought, no matter what we do, even if we present a wide range of candidates, there won't be a high voter turnout anyhow. So let's just put in our candidates, reduce competition, and get our candidate elected. And in fact, Mr. Raisi's presidency means that the more hardline elements, I will show that to you in a minute, will have more power in Europe. A second possibility is that maybe this was a price that Mr. Khamenei, the supreme leader, had to pay to reduce the hardline opposition to external de-escalation. We should not forget, Iran is de-escalating by negotiating about a return to the JCPOA, but Iran is also de-escalating regionally by talking indirectly, directly with different players, especially the talks with Saudi Arabia are an important piece of the current strategy in foreign relations. And we know that in the past, at many instances, the initiatives by the political elite to de-escalate were severely disrupted by hardliners in Iran. For example, remember the 2016 attack on the Saudi embassy in Tehran, which then led to complete escalation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the hardliners always played the card of being the spoiler, being the disruptor, and maybe the only way of de-escalating externally was by consolidating their power internally. This is another thesis. There is a third thesis which talks about a new social contract, talks about, and this is very much connected to the fourth thesis that exists, which says the Iranian political elite is trying to push the country from being a revolutionary state, a state that emerged from the 1979 revolution, and still trying to consolidate itself, legitimize itself as a revolutionary state, towards being what we may call a normal state. And when I say normal, that doesn't mean a Western normal, a democratic structure, but rather a stable structure similar to Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey. So don't immediately think, try to benchmark it against Western values, but rather benchmark it around the concept of, is it a stable structure? Is it a structure that can provide for the people and so on? So this notion of it's a critical phase, and it is a critical phase because many believe that Mr. Khamenei, who is 82, will die in the next few years. And the question is, how will the succession issue be resolved? What kind of institutions will be more empowered compared to others? So this notion of a controlled process, a controlled political process, by not allowing elections and other political bargaining process to disrupt this process. So these are the theses, but let's try to understand which one is more, or how we can look at the different signposts and signals that are emerging to confirm one or the other. First, very quickly, the election results. You have seen the figures, but I will share some nuances about the figures. Obviously, Raisi won with close to 62% of the votes cast. But one important fact, voter participation was 48.8%. This is the lowest ever in a presidential election. We had a lower national participation last year in the parliamentary elections with about just below 43%. But back then, many believed that the corona pandemic and all the issues emerging from it played a role. But this is the first time, just as a benchmark, 4 years ago, voter participation was 73.3%. So you can see the difference. In Tehran, voter participation was 26%, lowest ever in any election. And that is obviously embarrassing for a regime that wants to say we are popular, the people are behind us. number of votes, I have put up the figures and you can see it. And again, you can see the benchmark with other elections. But what is most striking is the number of void ballots. 3.7 million void ballots, about 13% of the entire vote. And what is very interesting, it's now come out in the meantime, is that about half of this, these votes actually were people who voted for Ahmadinejad, the former president, who was also rejected. I did not mention him, but that was expected because he was also rejected 4 years ago when he tried to run for president. So it shows protest. It shows the fact that a lot of Iranians don't feel represented. In fact, there was a poll in which 75% of the Iranian population said they did not feel represented by any of these 4 candidates. And this is the important figure. But I know that some analysts would then immediately jump to the conclusion that, well, 75% of the Iranians are ready to enter into a violent upheaval. That's not the case. There is a high level of voter apathy. There is a high level of disappointment. But there is, I don't think, and there are different polls to look at, that this disappointment will translate into a violent upheaval. It's more a way of communicating discontent, especially with the economic conditions on the ground. We will get to the economic conditions in a minute. So in a way, we can say that Raisi got about 25% of the popular vote. If it would have been 100% participation, Raisi would have gotten 25%. And that's more or less the segment of the society that genuinely believes in this political structure and has benefited from this political structure, especially lower income classes. But the other 75%, they are not represented in the current political landscape. And that is definitely a big issue for the legitimacy moving forward. The other point that's very important, as I told you, there was a last attempt by the reformists and moderates to support Mr. Hemmati. But what he got in the end was 8% of the cast ballots. If you put it on the entire society, we are talking about 4% support for the reformists. And that's a big, big disaster, because in the past, we would always say it's true that there is a 25% support for the current political structure, but there is also at least 25 to 30% support for reformism. That support is not there anymore. And that means that the society as a whole is a lot more disengaged from the political process compared to previous times. And that is important, especially when we towards the future. So let's move on. I want to talk about how the composition of power has changed in Iran. And those of you who know me know that I disagree with this attempt to capture the political currents in Iran with Western concepts. For example, conservatives and or moderates. The reality on the ground is very different. For example, Mr. Raisi, when it comes to political and cultural issues, he's an ultra-conservative. But when it comes to economic issues, suddenly he would side with the leftist parties in Europe. So those terms don't really capture in Iran, the political currents and the political beliefs in Iran. What is more is this type of division. In Iran, we do have 4. They are not even political currents, they are mindsets. There is a political ideological mindset that focuses more on the sort of political realities, cultural realities, ideological realities, and derives a lot of authority from the religious structures, whether it's clerical or other structures. We also have a pragmatic mindset The pragmatic mindset, I always discuss it or describe it as a reflection of the Bazari mentality, of the sort of merchant mentality that we Iranians have. Remember the late president, Mr. Rafsanjani, he was a pragmatic person. I mean, he would try to look for the better deal rather than trying to impose his ideology on issues. We also have a very strong technocratic mindset, you know, the desire to have the latest technology, the desire to be connected to global markets and especially Western markets and Western technology. And finally, a nationalistic mindset. The nationalistic mindset is a lot more focused on creating domestic capacity, whether it's technological capacity or you know, defense capacity, military capacity, and so on. For example, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was very much from this nationalistic mindset. Now, if we quickly map the key people on the Rouhani, so still today, not under the Raisi. The next slide will show you the Raisi thing. But obviously, we have President Khamenei in the middle of the ideological mindset. The current president, Rouhani, is actually closer to the pragmatic mindset, but has some foot in the conservative mindset as well. The current head of the judiciary, Raisi, is very much affiliated with the ideological mindset, with the ultra-conservative clerics and so on. The Guardian Council also very firmly there. The interesting thing is that no matter how powerful each of these structures are, the composition of some of the key councils, for example, the Supreme National Security Council, is designed in a way that all the different mindsets, currents, whatever you want to call them, are present. So this is how the current thing is, because obviously the president sits in the Supreme National Security Council and heads it, but then there are also military people, there are ministers and so on. The current mayor of Tehran, Mr. Hanakshi, is very much between pragmatic and technocratic mindsets. That will also change. You will see it on the next slide. Someone like the governor of the central bank is very much in the heart of the technocratic mindset. Expediency Council, etc., etc. The parliament was won by the conservatives / hardliners, and a lot of the hardliners move into the nationalistic mindset. Also, the Revolutionary Guards is a lot more nationalistic than it is ideological. It's important to understand. However, there is another element in the RGC, which is called the RGC intelligence. That is led by a cleric, has sort of more footprint or is fed a lot more by the conservative factions, by the ideological mindset. We have the Bazaris, we have semi-state institutions. I want to show you how this map will change the day Raisi will come into power. And this is obviously the supreme leader, Khamenei. As long as Khamenei is the supreme leader, he will sort of represent this ideological core of the Islamic Revolution. But obviously the new president, Mr. Raisi, will very much also be in that. So we will have a lot less influence from the pragmatic side, from the pragmatic mindset on key decisions. Judiciary, depending on who becomes the new head of the judiciary, but I would be very surprised if Mr. Khamenei appoints someone from the pragmatic side. So most probably the new judiciary head will also be positioned there. You can see a lot of the top decision-making powers. So the Supreme National Security Council, through the fact that Rouhani and his ministers won't be in there anymore, will shift to the right. And you can see there will be some technocratic input because there are ministers and so on, but it will be pushed towards the more nationalistic ideological mindset. The municipality of Tehran, the mayor of Tehran will change because there is a new local council, and the new local council is also more conservative. So most probably there is talk about a couple of the former RGC commanders become the next mayor of Tehran. So you can see a much stronger RGC footprint into some of the executive matters as well. And there will probably be also a few RGC commanders sitting in the Raisi government. So you will see shifts there. The Expediency Council will move closer to the political mindset. And the parliament is exactly where it was because we haven't had parliamentary elections. RGC exactly where it's RGC and the Bazaris. Now, remember, ministries under Rouhani were on this side. Now they will all move to this side. So that you can't really you can't completely eliminate the technocratic mind from the ministries because they're actually running things. They're managing executive matters, but you can shift them towards this end. And you, as I said, you will have a lot of the nationalistic mindset, similar to what we had under Ahmadinejad until 2013, will then shift again. What does this mean for domestic politics? Let's look at some of the consequences. First of all, key ministries will be controlled by hardline networks rather than by the pragmatic networks of the past 8 years. There will also be a greater alignment between the government and the Majlis. Some say this is great, this is perfect, because you know, the more alignment between the government and the Majlis, the easier it will be to make decisions and implement decisions. Fact is, this is what we expected under Ahmadinejad. Remember, the 2004 Majlis elections produced the conservative Majlis, and the 2005 presidential elections produced Ahmadinejad. It took a few months to see new splits and new competitions, and this we will see this time as well. And there is an important reason for this split. At the end of the day, it's not about political agendas of political currents. It's about networks competing for power, competing for influence. And once you have networks, even if they belong to the same mindset, when they start competing for resources, they will have disagreements. And in fact, during the presidential debate, you saw very clear disagreements between Raisi and Jalili, the other person from that side. So it's very important to understand. The other fact, and some of you may be completely new to this, but within the intellectual debates in Iran, there is always a reference to different networks and different rings. And usually these rings are around a specific city or a specific province. Now, Raisi comes from Mashhad, the site of the shrine of the 8th Imam, an important religious and political city in Iran, and also geographically very important. But look who else is from Mashhad. Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, Friday prayer speaker of Mashhad, Mr. Alam al-Huda, who, by the way, is a senior cleric and also the father-in-law of Raisi. So these two are. Ahmad Marvi, the current head of the Astan Quds Razavi, the largest religious institution in Iran and religious foundation in Iran, and Saeed Jalili, who ran for president, but withdrew in favor of Raisi, a former nuclear negotiator. He was the former secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, and some say that he may become the next foreign minister or one of the top vice presidents in the country. This not only consolidates the hardline element, but also consolidates the position of Mashhad in Iranian politics. Some argue that Mr. Khamenei, the supreme leader himself, should also be considered part of the Mashhad ring. He grew up in Mashhad, but he's originally from Azerbaijan, from the Turkish-speaking province in Iran. And me as an Azeri would like to see him more in the Azeri ring rather than the Mashhad ring, but he has close ties to Mashhad. And obviously some of these people were also his appointees throughout their political career. So this will have significance in Iran when it comes to decisions, when it comes to infrastructure decisions and other decisions. And you can also imagine that because of geography, relations with Central Asia and Afghanistan will take on a very different shape under a Raisi government compared to previous governments. What else? Raisi has said already that he will bring in so-called revolutionary experts into the executive branch. We know these revolutionary experts. These are younger, relatively well-educated technocrats in the Iranian structure. The biggest problem with them is they have a trial and error mentality. So we will go back to a lot of the trial and error approaches that we saw during the Ahmadinejad years. And that can, that will certainly cost, as an economist, I can tell you, it will cost the Iranian economy, because there will be a lot of mistakes and there will be a lot of sort of incompetence. But unfortunately, this is a fact we have to accept. There is some speculation that the Raisi government will have to increase or generate some legitimacy after having come to power based on a very low legitimacy of voter participation. And that could happen in the fields of fighting corruption, changing some governance realities, allowing some more space in the cultural space. There was a piece in the FT yesterday which talked exactly about this, that there is a push from the society, but also an acceptance from the authorities that maybe there could be some new space in the cultural fields. But when we look at actions, for example, a new law in the parliament that's being passed to create more restrictions in the cyberspace, then there may be certain limitations to that approach, but we will have to wait and see. The society remains very disengaged. As I said, the protest of not voting was very loud and very clear. But what is very important, and what I've put down here is a quote from a civil society leader from the city of Tabriz, which is very interesting. She said, because we were actually debating whether to vote or not to vote, and I was saying, by not voting, you don't achieve anything. She said, our not voting or non-participation is actually the beginning of, this is exactly what she said, the beginning of a non-violation movement. And one of the leaders of these types of movements is Faiz Hashemi, the daughter of the late former president Rafsanjani. And in a very interesting development, in my view, she said almost the same thing in a speech yesterday. So the forces are there, the society is there, and there is a desire to push for greater freedoms, not necessarily for a political restructuring. I think there is a push for more freedoms, economic stability, which is one of the key issues in Iran, and so on. So, and when we look at the business community, who has always been, an important player in the process, they are also disengaged from politics. It's very important to understand. When we go back to the Khatami years, late 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of engagement from the business community to influence political developments. That engagement has disappeared, partly because they realized they haven't been successful, and that means that the business community will not try to influence the political development, but they will try to influence their own situation, sort of business climate, and so on. And in fact, a very interesting, the very first campaign step by Raisi was actually to visit the Iran Chamber of Commerce and talk to the business community, because they know, everyone knows, that the only way Iran can sort of overcome the current economic challenges and socio-economic challenges is by creating jobs. And creating jobs without the business community is impossible in a country like Iran. So there are a lot of suggestions that this whole process of Raisi becoming the president means that he's the chosen one to be the next supreme leader. It may be the case, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. And it will all depend on when Mr. Khamenei passes away, and when this whole question of succession will be up. I mean, if it happens in 3 months, I can tell you Mr. Raisi will be the most likely candidate. But if it happens in 3 years, and Raisi has left a very bad track record as a president, he will be the last person the political elite will want as the next supreme leader. So it's not a foregone conclusion. We can talk more about it if we have time in the question and answer session. Impact on regional and international relations, very quickly. One question is, what will happen to the JCPOA negotiations? I can report to you that the JCPOA decisions have been made in the Supreme National Security Council. They are understood as a decision by the political leadership, not necessarily a government decision. And obviously, if the different parties manage to sign an agreement before the change of government, which is early August, then Raisi has already confirmed that he will obviously comply by the agreement and return to the JCPOA. If it doesn't happen, what will happen is that personalities will change. There will be a new nuclear negotiator from the Iranian side. There will be new faces in the Supreme National Security Council, and that in itself will create delays and challenges. But it's important to know that as a regime decision, as a government, as a decision by the political elite, it's accepted by the hardliners. As I said, personnel changes will undermine some of the positive dynamics. I mean, if Saeed Jalili becomes the next foreign minister, it will have a very negative impact, especially on relations with Western governments. But there is talk about Amir Abdullahian as the next minister, and he was also a deputy minister before, so he's quite familiar, especially with the immediate region in Iran. So let's wait for those faces, let's not speculate. But fact is that very few people will be able to accomplish in terms of international relations what Mr. Zarif and his team have managed to do in the past 8 years. Those of you who know about the leaked tape, the leaked interview by Mr. Zarif, know that in that interview, he talked about the tension between what he called the diplomacy and battlefield. Battlefield is, especially in the region where the Quds Force, the RGC, undertake things that have an impact on Iran's relations with the region, but are not necessarily coordinated with the foreign ministry. So he spoke about this tension between diplomacy and battlefield. Well, one fact about a Raisi government is that there will be a lot more alignment between diplomacy and battlefield. Some say this will be good, but again, we have to wait and see what really happens on the ground, because there are too many moving parts at this stage in the region, in the world, in the oil market, etc., etc. So all of these factors will play a role. What is important is that the regional dialogue, and Raisi has already confirmed that in his first press conference, will continue. Raisi and especially the religious constituencies behind him, they're very interested in better relations with Saudi Arabia, not just because of Hajj, but because that's, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of alignment with Islamic countries is a lot more important for them than alignment with Western powers. I mentioned the fluidity in the region. This will confuse and put pressure on everyone, and as such, we should not expect clear-cut agendas, more rhetoric and more sort of testing the waters here and there. Iran's established strategy over the past decade or so to become a regional hub for connectivity, whether it's transit connectivity, whether it's energy interconnectivity, will continue. It's very, very much sort of consolidated within the psyche of the country at this stage, because they see the markets and the benefits, and also the other also security benefits of these situations. One new development, again, another element of fluidity, is obviously the situation in Afghanistan, the empowerment of the Taliban, even though you will find some hardliners in Iran who would try to negotiate with the Taliban, but the general feeling is that Iran should stop the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, and that could pave the way for some sort of a new sort of track of talks between Iran and the US and other world powers. Again, we will have to wait and see whether that happens, but it's definitely a concern in Iran. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through this very quickly because I think you will find the figures better, but essentially, if you look at maximum pressure in the past 3 years and look at how Iran has reacted, if I wanted to say that in a couple of sentences, it is Iran has created a lot of domestic capacities to replace imports, but also it has tried to expand regional trade, because these are markets that are a lot more accessible for Iranian businesses in a time of sanctions. So this has happened. So maximum pressure has put a lot of pressure on Iran, but has not necessarily made Iran, pushed Iran into isolation. Iran is still connected, and the connection is there. China is the largest trading partner. China is important. Then you have 4 of the neighbors as the other top 5 trading partners. And when you look at the fastest growing trading partner of Iran, that's Russia. And that Russia will play an important role in the Raisi strategy, because again, the more nationalistic mindset of Iran, they look at Russia, they look at Putin's Russia as a model, as a model of power projection, presence, and in a way, anti-Americanism. So I have prepared 4 graphs that will give you a bit of an idea about where the economy is going. One, each graph has 2 lines. One is the situation without sanctions, meaning they managed to restore the JCPOA, sanctions are lifted, and the Iranian economy can sort of move a bit more freely. And the other one is with sanctions. So, when we look at the GDP growth, I'm just going to have some water. When you look at the GDP growth, the Iranian GDP, the Iranian economy declined by about 12% since 2018 when the maximum pressure started, but it actually returned to marginal growth this year. And the path forward is without sanctions, Iran can go up, the economy can go up to an annual growth of 5 to 6%. With sanctions, it will just stay around 2 to 3%. And that is, both are actually not sufficient to create enough jobs. But obviously, it's not I read one piece by one of these analysts who said the Iranian is about to collapse. That's not the case. It's not collapsing, but it's also not thriving. But obviously, the lifting of sanctions will help in that process of growing a bit more, adjusting a bit more to the expectations of the society. Inflation has been very high. In fact, one of the facts that compelled a lot of Iranians not to vote is their discontent with the economic situation, especially with the high inflation. I mean, inflation in the 40s and 30s has become the norm. And that will obviously, that situation, the inflationary pressures will ease if the sanctions are lifted and Iran can access its hard currency reserves and also repatriate its exports. So inflation could go down to 10 to 15% without sanctions, but will stay around 30% with sanctions. So 2 more. Obviously, one of the questions is always how much can Iran produce and export crude oil. Here, with sanctions, they have managed to actually export about 1 million barrels of crude and condensate and a growing amount of petroleum products. So with sanctions, all of them together, Iran can export between 1 to 1.5 million barrels a day. But if sanctions are lifted, they can rehabilitate both production and export and hit about 3 million barrels of export, including petroleum products, by the beginning of 2022. And that will obviously ease a lot of the economic pressures in Iran. Finally, unemployment. Unemployment, interestingly, and that's part of the economic response to pressure. Unemployment figures have actually improved over the past few years because there is obviously a lot more local production, but how they will depend a lot on whether sanctions are lifted. And you can see by 2024, the difference could be 2%. I mean, Iran will not go to, 2%, 3% unemployment. Unemployment will stay above 5% and closer to 10% because of demography. But obviously, the more relaxed the economic conditions, the more jobs can be created. Okay, my last slide. What does this all mean for international business? Obviously, a restoration of the JCPOA could open up the market, similar to what happened in 2016 and 2017. By the way, in 2016, 2017, the economy grew considerably as a result of the lifting of sanctions. I don't imagine a similar economic explosion because a lot of companies will be hesitant, not knowing what the next US president will do. So it's as long as this tension remains, it will be difficult to attract Western companies to Iran, but there will be a lot of other international companies, especially Chinese, Russian, Indian, and so on, who will be in the market. Even after the lifting of the US sanctions, there could be other bottlenecks. I mean, you know that Iran has still not fully enacted the FATF related laws and legislations. There is a lot of talk that it may happen, but again, we have to wait and see how the different political players will play. But I can tell you that if the sanctions are lifted, it will become very likely that the FATF legislation will be implemented. By the way, most of these FATF related actions related to banking services and so on already in place, which shows is an indication that they generally are interested, but obviously there are political considerations. I mentioned Iran can rehabilitate its production and exports within a few months. Last time, everyone was surprised by the speed of how fast they recovered, not only production, but also export markets. And one advantage that Iran has in recapturing export markets is that because it has a high volume of condensate, it can blend crude oil and condensate to produce the grade that refineries ask for. And that is one competitive advantage that Iran has. If the different parties don't manage to restore the JCPOA, there will be a deeper consolidation of ties with Russia and China. As I said, for example, if a moderate president would have come to power, there would be a lot less emphasis on Russia. But with the hardliners, with the sort of, especially the nationalistic mindset in Iran, there is a lot of attention towards Russia, because as I said, they look at Russia as a model. We know that the RGC companies were in a process of expanding their role in the economy and in many sectors, and this obviously will increase further with the current election. When I look at the situation from the Western companies, there could always be a conclusion that it's very difficult to achieve. But I would also say that there are possible strategies, and especially so-called triangle strategies. If you don't want to do it with Chinese and Russian companies, there are also Turkish companies. There are other neighboring nations that could offer a platform to work together with Iran. So it's not the end of the Iran business for many European and Western companies, but you definitely need to develop new strategies. You know that Iran and China signed a partnership agreement, 25-year partnership, which is only a framework for other potential initiatives, but that could lead to a lot of Chinese investments in Iran, and this government will also be interested. The point I just made a minute ago, because of the domestic capacity building, there is a lot of internal industrial capacity that will change the nature of the Iranian sort of demand for intermediary products as opposed to to raw materials and basic products. And that's something you have to take into consideration. I'm going to stop here and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Bijan. We have a number of questions. Anyone who wants to ask a question, please write them on the chat function. That includes you, Simon Casey, with your hand up. There is, okay, the first question. To what extent do you think the conformity between the three powers, legislature, executive, judiciary, has been achieved, is desired by the revolutionary regime for after Khamenei's period or during the power transition for him?
I mentioned this in my discussion. It is. I mean, if we just believe that there are clear political agendas, yes. I mean, the new government and the current Majlis and the judiciary would all be aligned. But as I said, these people represent different networks, and these networks are sometimes based on regional platforms, sometimes based on ethnic platforms and other issues. And usually, as long as we have networks trying to coalesce, there will always be disagreements. And I don't think it's the end of the ongoing processes in the country. So it's definitely better than it was before, but it's definitely also not the case that they're all fully aligned and fully agreeable on every single issue.
Okay, to what extent do you think a constitutional revision is probable for the sake of presidential office revoke? Then a prime minister could be elected by parliament instead of people's direct vote.
This has been in various debates, actually long before the election. Even I think the very first sort of discussion of a parliamentary system as opposed to a presidential system came from the Supreme Leader himself. I can't remember the date, but probably about 6-7 years ago, when he said Iran could think about a parliamentary system where the parliament then elects the prime minister, and the prime minister becomes the chief of the executive branch. And again, if you go back, many analysts had said, oh, Rouhani will be Iran's last president. Well, it didn't happen. I mean, there are good arguments in favor and also against this. At the end of the day, the power structure is one that is very unique. And in a way, you can say that the Supreme Leader is the highest authority, individual authority, but then there are so many other councils. And in fact, the Guardian Council's reaction to Khamenei's demand before the elections showed that Khamenei is not the single most powerful person, that councils can actually disagree with him. I think there are definitely forces who would like to have a constitutional amendment, and it wouldn't be the first time in Iran, and it could change the political structure. But I think that's not the issue. The issue is, increasing governance efficiency. Iran has a very, very low efficiency in governance because of corruption, because of incompetence, as I mentioned, because of trial and error mentality. That needs to be repaired, and that's the big question, whether Raisi will have the resolve to do that.
Okay, do you see OFAC, US and OFAC sanctions being completely lifted by the end of this year?
I think the so-called JCPOA negotiations have come very far. There are a number of disagreements, one on whether the US will lift all the sanctions that were introduced during the Trump years, or only those sanctions that are relevant to the JCPOA. And on the Iranian side, there are some questions about, what to do with, for example, some of the additional centrifuge research that Iran has carried out during these years which should have not happened under the original JCPOA. It takes political will on both sides to find a final resolution. I think the Americans were waiting for the election to see what kind of a commitment will come from the new government in Iran. I think they have that answer. They know that Raisi has committed to continuing the JCPOA. What they don't have from Iran is a sort of a commitment at this stage that they will definitely move on to follow-on talks. That was the original demand from the US. They have dropped it in the meantime, but I think the desire is there. And when you look at it from the US perspective, if they really go back to the original JCPOA, the problem will start in 2023 when some of the sunsets kick in. And so they know that they need some sort of a follow-on adjustments. And that obviously can only happen if they show Iran enough political goodwill, because the Iranians say correctly that it was the US that reneged the original deal, and they need to sort of prove that a new agreement won't be reneged again. So it's a very difficult position, but my feeling, especially because of what's happening in Afghanistan, is that it's more likely than not that they will agree on a revival of the JCPOA. If they agree, most of the US secondary sanctions will be lifted. I underline secondary sanctions, those that were lifted because of the JCPOA. And then there will be obviously new attempts by both sides to position themselves to represent their interests. It is a complicated situation, but I think both sides would like to revive the deal for Iran because it will unleash some of the economic potential of the country, create jobs, lead to greater growth, and also legitimize the government. And for the US side, because they genuinely know that a better relationship with Iran could reduce a lot of the other tensions. I mean, we just have had these US attacks on the Syrian-Iraqi border, which is another sign of existing tensions that even compel the US to attack military targets. So the will is there. It's likely, but it's not 100%.
All right, I think we've covered sanctions. There are a number of other questions about that, but there are other ones as well. So let's rattle through them. What's the attitude and belief in Iran to Chinese technological capacity?
It depends on the sector. There was a time when I was still in Iran in the thousands where the average Iranian technocrat and business person did not really believe in the Chinese technology. And part of it was also that it was not always the first tier technology from China coming to Iran. Sometimes it was second and third tier technology coming. It has changed. The Chinese companies have changed. The Iranian companies have changed. And there are sectors where the Iranians, even in the best of relationship with Western companies, they will opt for Chinese companies. For example, rail and road construction, a lot of the construction solutions, some telecom solutions. But then there are other sectors where the Iranians feel that the Iranians themselves are better than the Chinese. For example, in the oil and gas sector. I mean, so it's not a sort of unified assessment. It depends on the sector. It depends, and that is partly also an advice to some of the companies on this call. It depends on what kind of a package you offer. Is there any foreign direct investment in the process? Is it a project that will create jobs in Iran? For example, one of the shortcomings of Chinese companies dealing with Iran was that they would always bring hundreds of Chinese engineers and workers to implement their project. That the Iranian side doesn't want. So depending on what kind of a package it is and which sector, there could be situations where the Iranians would genuinely prefer Chinese companies.
Okay, I think you answered already to say that the regime is not about to collapse, but when it does, what do you think will, or rather, what do you think will succeed the current regime?
One of the reasons the Islamic Republic is not about to collapse is because there is no real alternative. I mean, there are no political groupings or forces that are credible. I mean, one thing I can tell you, and I'm saying this as someone who is sitting in Vienna, in Austria, outside Iran, is that the majority of elite members in Iran, they don't want to engage in a post-Islamic Republic process that is initiated outside Iran. That's why military intervention, supporting whatever consent in Iran from outside is not going to lead to any successful process. And a lot of Iranians also understand this. I mean, the level of political awareness is high enough for them to understand, without a clear and credible alternative, all that a violent push will achieve is potentially a civil war or a situation that will be much, much worse than what we have in Iran today. So there is no clear alternative. I think the only alternative that many Iranians believe in right now is what I mentioned during the presentation, this non-violent pro-liberalization movement. How far they can go, we can only speculate. I mean, the regime has been very heavy-handed with clamping down on any type of process, but we should not forget, legitimacy is very low, and depending on how the new composition of power under Raisi is shaped, there may be projects or initiatives that could change or reduce some of the social grievances against the regime.
Okay, we've got 3 or 4 more quick questions. Can you say more about the Iran-Saudi talks in Baghdad? Are they serious? Are they comprehensive?
I can tell you from the Iranian side, they are serious. There is a genuine will to de-escalate. Don't forget, as I said, Iran's strategy, sort of trade and economic strategy, will rely a lot on trade with immediate neighbors. And trade with immediate neighbors means that you have to have a better relationship with immediate neighbors. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE are important neighbors. I think from the Saudi perspective, the realization that the US is about to withdraw from the region has compelled them to rethink the relationship with Iran. And this is one thing that experts have always said, the US may or may not stay, but Iran will always be here. Yeah. And Iran will always, could always become an irritant for security issues, for regional issues, and so on. And so my feeling is they are real. Obviously, there are a lot of competing agendas, regional, also domestic in both countries. But I think they are serious, and they could really lead to some degree of de-escalation, not necessarily 100% normalization, but degree of de-escalation.
Okay, will Iran refocus trade relations with regional markets and move away from the West? I think you've answered that already to say yes. Yeah,
no, I mean, I wouldn't say Iran would move away from the West. Even a Raisi government realizes that there are opportunities, and don't forget, Raisi and sort of the ultra-conservatives, they are very closely affiliated with the Bazaris in Iran. And the Bazaris historically have been interested in trade and also trade with Western countries. However, they feel a lot less vulnerable if their trading partners, especially export markets, are immediate neighbors. and they have been burnt with the experiences with Europe in the past decades.
Okay, with the abandoning of the Chabahar project with India, will China replace India? Will India lose trade as it moves closer to the US?
I don't think so. I mean, first of all, it depends on whether sanctions are lifted. If the sanctions are lifted, I think India could definitely have a place in the Chabahar project, especially because India really needs that infrastructure to export to Afghanistan and
You're breaking up a little.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so I was just saying, if sanctions are not lifted, then it's very likely that Chinese and maybe other investors would replace Indian investors. But if sanctions are lifted, I do see Indian companies back in that project because it's really important for them.
All right. The non-violent movement was not effective in Lebanon because people had to confront the militias. Similarly, with the Basij in Iran, how would a similar movement succeed in Iran, i.e. a non-violent one?
I mean, it depends on what the objectives of that campaign are. I mean, if you talk to Iranian women, for example, they will tell you that there has been a change in the approach to the Islamic dress code, how tightly controlled Islamic dress code has been, and how much space there is for some more liberal dress codes. Some may say, well, this was a side effect of the coronavirus. It will change as soon as the pandemic is done. But others may say, well, it's one way of the sort of political system giving more space to the society in lieu of the political space that they don't have. So it depends on what the objectives. If the objective is to entirely change the political structure, it won't happen. Yeah. If the objective is to get more social and cultural freedoms, I think it will be successful. Don't forget, all of the different players, whether it's the Basij or the Revolutionary Guards or the clergy themselves, they are also witnessing the change, and they are also sort of reevaluating their priorities and their approaches. So let's just wait and see. I don't think we can say it's definitely unsuccessful, and I can also say it will definitely not succeed if it wants to change the political realities. But some of the cultural realities and social realities can be changed.
All right, two last questions. One, do you think the financial mechanisms such as Instex will be broadly used? Because the Americans have recently been positive about American trade with Iran. Humanitarian trade with Iran.
Yes, I mean, some may think that if the sanctions are lifted, then there will be no need for Instex or the Swiss humanitarian channel. But in fact, they could still play a very important role, because even without sanctions, for example, European or international companies who want to trade with Iran, they will still need to do their own due diligence on whether it's individuals or entities that are sanctioned on the other side, or whether the banking route is a good one. So Instex and the Swiss humanitarian channel could play an important role in facilitating trade transactions with Iran. So I do see them as still playing an important role.
Okay, last question. How does the Kurdish population in Iran fit in with the wider Kurdish diaspora? Is there a political movement within this community working with or against the government?
We need another workshop.
Another time, maybe.
It's a very complex topic. There are certainly Kurdish forces in Iran who are not happy with the situation and would sort of try to push for greater autonomy for the Kurds in Iran. But most of the opposition activity, if we can call it opposition activity, Kurdish opposition activity, is happening from outside Iran, from the Kurdish regions in Turkey and in Iraq. And I don't think the majority of the Kurds agree with the approach of having a militant approach to the Iranian government. As I said, there is discontent. One thing that we didn't get time to discuss, but I think is important, maybe we think about another webinar down the line, is there is a growing role that the local councils are playing in Iran compared to 2 decades ago. So the way I describe it right now is there is a sort of anti-democratic movement at the national level, but a sort of democratization movement on the local level. I mention this because it's now more and more feasible for the Kurds or other ethnic minorities in Iran to be represented in a lot of the power relations through their own people, rather than having to rely on a non-Kurdish Shiite minister sitting in Tehran. So these local councils could play a role, so they could take away some of the grievances, but there are very deep grievances, not just among the Kurds, but also among the other minorities. And as I said, it's too complex. It's not a one-minute answer that I can give to this question.